Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be here and to see so many people interested in Russia. I think that maybe people don't feel like thanking Mr. Putin for many things, but I think we have to thank him for the size of this audience. And I mean, there are historical precedents for interest in Russia when Russia or its predecessor has done things that we have found very reprehensible. I remember the Christmas Day invasion, or the December 1979 invasion of Afghanistan, Soviet invasion of Afghanistan in 1979, and I was the only person in America who was glad, because I said, oh, my enrollment in my Soviet history course is going to double. And it certainly did. I come to Russia with not just an interest, but a very deep passion, a very deep personal history. Both of my parents were born in St. Petersburg, Russia, before the revolution of 1917. They emigrated as members of what the Soviets called the big bourgeoisie to Berlin and then Paris, and met and married in Paris and came to New York shortly before World War II. And oddly enough, they were born in St. Petersburg. All of my mother's three sisters, later, when they became old, moved to St. Petersburg, Florida. So they were born in St. Petersburg and they died in St. Petersburg, but they were two different cities. As Ambassador Burns has said, exactly a year ago, President Yanukovych of Ukraine had fled. We actually didn't know where to. He later surfaced in Russia. This was also a period when, in any event, the world had been focused on Russia. Of course, the drama and glory of the Sochi Olympics were on at that time. One very telling Russian newspaper headline from that day, so literally February 21st, 2014, was in the Russian newspaper Komsomolskaya Pravda, which had a front page headline that warned, "Capturing Ukraine, Bandera is aimed at Russia." Bandera, who was Bandera? Bandera, Stepan Bandera, was a mid-20th century Ukrainian nationalist who tried to use the German invasion of the USSR in World War II in 1941 to detach Ukraine from the Soviet Union. So he was a synonym for pro-fascist treachery. So the headline, Bandera is now aimed at Russia, showed that from the start, the events in Kiev that overturned the pro-Russian government a year ago were depicted not as some people would have it when you hear about current Russian complaints, that it was the result of American machinations so much, but it's the very reincarnation of the German fascism, the victory over which the USSR and this post-Soviet Russia have commemorated as a holiday every May 9th for the past 50 years, since 1965. Now, I use that word, that date. I know the war ended in 45, but this was in 65. You might have read about the fact that Vladimir Putin, others in Russia, have continued to call the Ukrainian government and its supporters fascists, those fascist thugs. This is not just some generic term for enemies. It's a specific appeal to the most powerful, symbolic, and historic event and moment in the modern Russian experience and political mythology. It equates today's Russia with the victorious Red Army that defeated Nazism and liberated Auschwitz, and equates Russia's actions with the need to defeat the new fascism, which is identical with the old fascism. And I'm going to talk about this because you might ask the question, with everything that's going on, with this war in the Donbass, in the eastern part of Ukraine, with the effects of the sanctions, and then, of course, other woes with the oil drop in the oil prices, why is it that President Putin's popularity ratings remain so high? I mean, they're in the 80s. They have never gone below 69 or 65%, but it's more than 80% approval rating. And why is the public opposition to the war so weak? There is some, but it's certainly no uprising. So that I want to address the question in a rather roundabout or historical way, talking about what the Russians call историческая политика, which means historical politics, the politics of public memory, the politics of history. So using the term fascism, it's interesting to note, by the way, and few people have pointed it out, that on the other side, the Ukrainians are also using this kind of language, referring to this war as their Great Patriotic War. On 24 August 2014, which was the commemoration of Ukrainian Independence Day, that is to say independence from the Soviet Union in 1991, President Poroshenko said that Ukraine in the Donbass, that's the word for the eastern Ukraine, is engaged in a great patriotic war. And then just last week, well, on Valentine's Day, an advisor to the Ministry of Internal Affairs of Ukraine said that the enemy was purposefully turning Debaltseve, which is the city that's been engulfed in fighting just in the past 96 hours, purposely turning Debaltseve into Stalingrad. Referring to the intensity of the shelling and destruction of this key railway junction. So we are looking at history wars. And as the title of my talk proclaims, history matters. I've called it History Matters, the Politics of the Past in Putin's Russia. And for Russia, no event in its modern history has ever mattered more than what it calls the Great Patriotic War. That's how the war has been referred to. Not all of World War II. World War II from 1939 to 45 is called the Second World War. But 1941 to 45, Russia, the Soviet Union's war against Germany and Germany's allies, is called the Great Patriotic War, and it got that epithet within a day of the war beginning on June 22nd, 1941. And not surprisingly, the equation in Russia of the current conflict with World War II spiked in the early fall with the September 1st, 2014, 75th anniversary of the outbreak of World War II, and that was an event that followed by exactly 1 month the centennial of the outbreak of World War I, and I'm going to say more about that later. So now we're in the 70th anniversary cycle of the commemoration of the major events of the Great Patriotic War. In Russia, these began 2 years ago, on February 2nd, 2013, because it was the 70th anniversary of the Battle of Stalingrad, which certainly was a turning point, the turning point in the war at great human cost. Last month, by the way, there was a telling moment, I don't know how many of you noticed, after Vladimir Putin had complained about not having been, quote, invited to Poland for the 70th anniversary of the liberation of Auschwitz on January 27th. Now, the invitation wasn't the word. Heads of state were not invited this time, but certainly Poland did what it could to not have Putin attend, even though he did attend 10 years ago for the 60th. In any event, he complained about it, and the Polish foreign minister enraged the Russians by asserting, and this is really history wars, that it's not such an important matter because, in fact, it was the first Ukrainian front that had liberated Auschwitz, and that it was Ukrainians who had liberated Auschwitz. Now, this is a political statement. And of course, Russia responded angrily that all nationalities of the USSR had served in the Red Army. We're looking at what I would call the ethnicization of the victory. But I want to focus on one particular word. Russian Foreign Minister Sergei Lavrov called the Polish statement sacrilegious. Now, sacrilegious. What's sacred here? And this brings me to Russia's veritable cult of the Great Patriotic War. Such a cult was launched in 1965 at the 20th anniversary as a kind of, of the victory, as a kind of organized venerational worship of an idealized version of the Soviet Union's experience in the war. It came to quickly eclipse the great legitimizing myth of the first half of the 20th century, the cult of Lenin and the myth of the revolution, whose 50th anniversary was celebrated in 1967. And now we have the Great Patriotic War with its saints, its wartime heroes, its relics. Its major relic was what actually was in the press called in 1975, on the 30th anniversary, the Holy of Holies. That was the so-called banner of victory, the red flag that had been raised on top of the Reichstag building on April 30th, 1945, by troops, by soldiers from the Red Army. And there was a very iconic photo of that flag raising, very much analogous to Joe Rosenthal's photograph of the flag raising on Iwo Jima, in fact, inspired by that photo. In any event, you had a basic master narrative. And the master narrative went like this. The well, no, they didn't say forced. The collectivization of the peasantry and rapid industrialization in the 1930s under the first and second five-year plans prepared our country for war, despite an overpowering surprise attack by the fascist beast and its brutal wartime practices, but despite the loss of 20 million valiant martyrs to our cause, our country, under the leadership of the Communist Party headed by Comrade Stalin, arose as one united front, expelled the enemy from our own territory and that of East Europe, thus saving Europe and the world from fascist enslavement. The message was salvational, and the suffering of the Soviet people, like that of Jesus Christ on the cross, was redemptive. Redemptive suffering. And redemptive suffering has always been a very important part of Russian Orthodox cultural tradition. And you see the building rapid proliferation of war memorials, every town, every village, war memorials with eternal flames, guarded by really children or teenagers in paramilitary uniforms, holding guns. It was always rather funny, girls in their short skirts with big organza white bows in their hair. And it became extremely important, and it also deeply resonated with the populace, which had in fact endured an incomparable ordeal that's been referred to before. So there was a spontaneous element. Newlyweds, after their wedding was registered and before going to the reception or party, would often stop at the local war memorial and leave a wreath or leave a bouquet of flowers in token to those who had died. The way Jews step on a glass in the wedding ceremony to remember the destruction of the temple in Jerusalem. And from the beginning, you have to understand that actually not the 20 million figure in terms of war dead was a figure kind of pulled out of the air by Nikita Khrushchev in the 1950s. But that was upped later to about 27 million. But the 27 million figure doesn't include this 2 to 3 million missing in action that were never found. So close to 30 million perished in this war. You have to think about the fact that our own country lost 400,000 people, and they lost 27 million. I mean, if there's any country that would qualify for an entire country suffering from post-traumatic stress syndrome or something like that, the Soviet Union would be it, especially when you consider that that war followed a long period of forced collectivization of the peasantry with resultant famine, of the purge and terror of the Communist Party, and of the greater population at large. So 30 million dead out of a population of about 190 million, more than 1,700 towns, over 70,000 villages destroyed, and it goes on and on. And so from the beginning during the war, there was a sense that this had to be an inspired battle, enormous sacrifices, a sacred war. And there was even a song that was composed on this day after the first troop trains left, called Holy War. And gosh, this is an opera house, right? So here goes. Вставай, страна огромная, вставай на светлый бой, с фашисткой силой темною, с проклятою ордой. Пусть ярость благородная вскипает, как волна, идет война народная. Священная война. Ura! All right. So I don't do visuals, but I do the oral stuff. And this meant, this is let noble rage boil up like a wave. We are in a holy war. And this kind of language was very important during the Brezhnev period, 1965 to 1985. This cult was upended at the very end of the Soviet period under Gorbachev after 1990. The figure of the war dead was up to 27 million officially. Many more truths came out about the war, the way the war was fought, that people were constantly told to attack, attack, attack. Stalin ordered, and the generals ordered, people to be thrown into battle like cannon fodder. Then there were criticisms that went over the top, that Stalin was responsible for as many Soviet deaths in the war as Hitler was. I even heard Jews say it would have been better if the Germans had won. I mean, that was pretty crazy. And critics saying, our narrative has completely got it backwards. We did not save the world from enslavement. We did not liberate Eastern Europe. We brought our own and equally evil occupation to Europe. The cult petered out. Eternal flames literally were allowed to burn out. War memorials were frequently not tended to. Add to this the voices of the Poles and peoples of the newly independent Baltic states coming out with a completely different narrative of occupation by the Soviets. What did all this do to the symbolic politics of the Kremlin? In the first years after the end of the USSR, Boris Yeltsin's administration devoted very little attention to symbols of Russian national pride. Yeltsin did bring back the old tricolored Russian flag, but mostly you see an attempt to destroy Soviet symbols, to knock down monuments. Streets were renamed or took back their old pre-revolutionary names, even attempts to try to right some of the sins of Bolshevism. I went to St. Petersburg to see the reburial of the Romanov remains in the St. Peter and Paul Fortress Cathedral. This happened on the 80th anniversary of their murder, July 1998. The reconstruction of the Cathedral of Christ the Savior, that's the cathedral, large cathedral in Moscow, where Pussy Riot had come in and sung their outrageous song about getting Mother of God, get Putin out. And that actually was built as a war memorial, as a memorial to the great First Patriotic War, the war against Napoleon in 1812. And if you came in a little bit early, there was some gathering music of the Overture 1812 by Tchaikovsky, where the Russian church bells and the Russian music drown out the Marseillaise. And this church, it took a long time for it to be built. It wasn't built till 1883 finally, but it was a memorial to that victory and a celebration of that victory. It was dynamited on Stalin's orders in 1931. And the idea that Yeltsin said was, we can't bring back all those dead that died at the hands of the Soviets, but we can rebuild this building, which was reconstructed. But Vladimir Putin, from the beginning of his presidency in 2000, appropriated symbols from the Soviet Union and old Russia. The Tsarist double-headed eagle, but also even more Soviet symbols. The national anthem that you just heard was the old Soviet national anthem that had been taken away under Yeltsin, but now it was brought back with new lyrics. But more than anything else, Vladimir Putin identified current Russia and himself personally with the victory in the Great Patriotic War. From the very beginning, in 2000, when he came in, the 55th anniversary of the war, he had medals struck with the visage of Stalin. He approved a bust of Stalin in the Museum of the Great Patriotic War that had recently opened. He frequently met with veterans. He talked about his own family's sufferings in World War II. He lost a brother in the Great Siege of Leningrad. Putin and his handlers chose an event of mythic proportions that underlines the unity and coherence of the nation and gives it legitimacy and status as a world power. And the Russians have often felt furious curious that the West hasn't recognized its great sacrifices or sufficiently recognized its sacrifices in the war. And all of this escalated in 2005, the 60th anniversary, because it was right in the wake of the 2004 Orange Revolution in Ukraine. And that event panicked Putin. He was terrified that there would be some kind of popular uprising in Russia also. That's when he founded Nashri, which is a sort of people called the Putin Jugend, the Russian youth movement that was so devoted to Putin and so nationalistic. Also, it followed, as it always does, the commemoration, the US and UK commemoration of the 60th anniversary of D-Day in 2004. The West thinks that they won the war, is their attitude. I remember the outrage. The first time I saw any of these commemorations was the big last Brezhnevite mega holiday in 1985. Was the 40th anniversary of the victory. And the year before, President Reagan had gone to Germany and visited Bitburg, a German cemetery where there had been some graves of people from the SS, and the Soviets were beside themselves. May 9th, 2005 was an enormous celebration, a military parade. George Bush actually came, President Bush came. You see a renewed cult of the war, even more strong than there had been the first 5 years of Putin's administration. But it's important to note that this recent and current cult differs significantly from the war cult of the Brezhnev era, 1965 to 85. While that cult of the Great Patriotic War was extravagant, triumphalist, self-congratulatory, I remember a kind of an orgy of self-congratulation coming back the next year. I felt that the only thing that compared to it was in 1986, I witnessed the 350th celebration of Harvard. You know, a little bit like that. It also, terrible. I'm an alumna, so. It also, that cult, and it's very important, people could say it was disingenuous, but it represented itself as standing for peace. We in the USSR suffered the greatest horrors of war, so we will be the greatest guardians of the peace. It was constantly an important part of it. You saw this impulse and still see it in Japan as well. And it also included a serious emphasis on the costs of victory. At the time, the figure was 20 million war dead. The enshrined 20 million war dead. Eternal flames. On May Day, there was a minute of silence that was on television where you saw the flickering flames of the eternal flame of the Tomb of the Unknown Soldier in Moscow, and there would be a voiceover talking about of a sort of a low, mellifluous baritone, talking about so many who had died. There were many songs lamenting fallen comrades. In the Soviet era then, the war was celebrated or commemorated as a source of both grief and pride, a reservoir of national suffering to be tapped, and also of national pride to be tapped, a source of loyalty, but never a source of raw joy and exaltation, which is what has become in the Putin era, especially in the past 10 years. A celebration of the Great Patriotic War as a victory of absolute good over absolute evil. Interestingly, that's a phrase that Matt Rajansky used last night in characterizing some sort of cliche views of the end of the Cold War in this country. Moreover, even though at the war's end, Stalin singled out the Russian people as the most decisive in the victory, in the high Soviet cult of the Brezhnev era, emphasis was placed on all Soviet peoples having fought and died and brought about the victory. But Putin, especially beginning in 2005, turned May 9th into a Russian national holiday, a kind of siege mentality to justify the strengthening centralization, the threat of extremism and terrorism. We have to have the same fighting spirit as in the Great Patriotic War. Ribbons were given out, and you might see I have this black and orange ribbon. Can you see that? This does not stand for Princeton University, despite the fact that it's black and orange. This is the so-called Georgian Ribbon. It was a ribbon of military glory dating at least from the 18th century. We have portraits of Catherine the Great with a big band of it. And it became the symbol of the victory. And people started carrying these ribbons at around this time. And now they were actually given out. People on the street, a lot of money was spent. I was walking around in Moscow on 25 for Victory Day, and people were just actually giving out CDs. Members of Nashi, that youth group in 1925 and 2005, CDs of war songs. This holiday mood, entertainment, even the minute of silence program was cut down from about 12 minutes, or sometimes it had been about 17 minutes, to 5 minutes. We just mourn a little bit, and then immediately there's a celebration. And the most important aspect was that this was a victory. The victory of the Soviet people and Red Army was transformed into a celebration of Russia and the Russian people. And Putin's speech at the ritual parade in 2005, his last words were "Slava России," glory to Russia, Ura, hooray. And the Great Patriotic War cult has grown even more since Putin's third inauguration. He was just inaugurated 3 days before the 2012 Victory Day commemoration. Ribbons now were de rigueur on all salespeople. In 1998, 70% of Russian citizens considered the 45 victory the most important event of the 20th century. In 2011, the figure had reached 90%, and now it's even more. There has been, in 2014, added to the wild approbation of the annexation of Ukraine, people are now started wearing the ribbon, this victory ribbon, just as a sign of patriotism. Crimea is ours. And one other thing I would like to say a few words about that's really fascinating for people like me, scholars of political memory, that you see in the past less than 2 years, the construction out of nothing of a Russian public memory of the Russian experience in World War I. The Russians lost, the Russian Imperial Army lost as many people as did the French in that war. And the Russian armies fought at first valiantly, and then went on an ignominious defeat, making a separate peace that was very deleterious to Russia. And then the memory was obliterated because it was so-called imperialist war, and it was followed by the Civil War, and there were the glories of the Red Army in the Civil War, and it was completely lost. There was no commemoration, no mention, no war memorials. I mean, you go to France. How can you find a town in France without a World War I memorial? There were virtually none in Russia until last year. Until 2013 it started, because Putin understood that he wanted Russia to be viewed at the centennial as one of the victorious powers in the war. And so there's a proliferation now of war memorials to World War I, and in the great area where there's the Museum of the Great Patriotic War and some monuments, hurriedly a new monument to the soldiers who died in World War I was erected. And now there are lessons in bravery. There's a campaign in the schools to think of the lessons and the inspiration that we get from the brave soldiers who died in World War I. A kind of cult of militarism. And this morning I went to my favorite website, which you all should go to every day, Kremlin.ru. Kremlin.ru is the presidential website, and the 70th anniversary commemorations actually began yesterday with the presentation of 70th anniversary medals to veterans. They're presented every 10 years since 1965. Timed to coincide, this is the first ceremony of the 70th anniversary cycle from 2015, with the run-up to February 23rd. Monday, February 23rd is Defender of the Fatherland Day. It used to be Soviet Army Day. Before that, it was Red Army Day, commemorating the anniversary of the founding of the Red Army on February 23rd, 1918, with Commissar of War Leon Trotsky. And Putin himself said to the veterans last night, it's highly symbolic that this ceremony is taking place in Kremlin's St. George's Hall, dedicated to the celebration of Russia's military glory. Now, St. George is the one who slew the dragon, and there are all these icons of St. George on a white horse slaying the dragon. He's the patron saint of Moscow. And so bringing in religion as it has become Russian Orthodoxy, kind of a state religion. So, and interestingly, Putin made a statement where he said to the veterans, and I just read it on my iPad this morning, "You saved our homeland and fulfilled the noble liberating mission that the entire world remembers in spite of everything." In spite of everything, no matter what. That is to say, we can do whatever we want, whatever we do in Ukraine or anywhere else. They won't take this away from us. And this victory is more important than anything. So it'll be fascinating to watch. It'll be fascinating to watch what happens now as the 70th anniversaries continue, celebrations, especially May 9th. Last year, just before the Victory Day, a law was passed criminalizing statements that devalue Soviet actions in World War II. And I argue that this 15-year-old celebration of military glory has so penetrated Russian political culture that it helps to explain why Russians are so accepting of the war in Ukraine. War which had always been viewed in Russia as a measure of last resort is now looked at as a policy that works. And this is what's most troubling. Thank you so much.